So Brody and Eddie, Brody was the older guy and he'd been in the house longer. And out of the goodness of her heart, she saw Eddie's picture on, I think, Kyoga's page. And he was
Eddie's,
like,
you said?
yeah,
Oh, I didn't realize she got Eddie from Kyoga.
yeah, or some shelter. But he was like emaciated. He had every problem you could have for picking a dog off the street, like worms and stuff. And she saw him and she's like, I have to have that one. And she said that the first couple months were great. And she said she remembers the exact day they started fighting and she was popping like plastic that comes in the shipping packages. And she popped it and they got startled and they just started fighting. And then ever since that moment, they began fighting anytime that they were in the room together, and pretty horrible fights. And she has two other dogs in the house. She's very into rescuing. She's a very strong CrossFit lady. And she was just like at a loss for what to do. She was devastated. So it was a long journey for her. So she sent me a text that I wanted to read that was pretty impactful to me. And she said, I've never ever been scared of dogs. And I know that dogs have their arguments, but I was completely terrified after this. Knew I was continuing with all my nervous energy, and I was not helping anything. I was beyond terrified that all four would get triggered and fight to the death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When did she send you that?
Like the second week.
Second week into
Yeah.
them being with us?
Yeah.
Yeah. Just kind of like getting the emotions out there. Like, I'm struggling with this.
Yeah. So it
Yeah.
was very apparent in that her struggle kind of motivated me to
Yeah.
get to the bottom of the dogs fighting.
Yeah, and it's, it's crazy. Like, so I have had multiple scenarios with myself and my personal dogs of dealing with like fighting issues and stuff like that. And like, especially early on. So years ago, my ex's dog and Vinny like literally hated each other. Like would fight to the death. Like they got in the most gnarly freaking fights with each other you could ever imagine. Like full knockout, drag out, like dragging them to the emergency vet because they got holes all over them kind of shit. Like terrifying stuff. You know what I mean? And that was something we needed to navigate and figure out, like, how are we going to get these dogs past this? And at the time, this was very early in my dog training career. You know what I mean? Like, I did not have all the answers. And I remember having multiple phone calls with Tyler in Buffalo, just being like, yo, like, what do I do? Like, I'm kind of at a loss right now. Like, I resorted every option that you see people talk about online of like, oh, well, you just like get their obedience better and you need to get them to respect you more and this and that. And like at some point, I think I just realized like that wasn't the solution, right? Like, we could make dogs do bed stays all day long, right? And we could make them do down stays away from each other all day long and this and that. And we could micromanage these behavioral issues forever until we're blue in the face, right? And try to work through these things that way. And it will be successful to an extent, you know what I mean? To an extent of as long as you're diligent about things, there's not going to be a problem. But unless something clicked that unless we teach these dogs to kind of figure out their issue with each other and kind of teach them how to more successfully interact with each other and change the way that we look at dogs, forget inner household, just dogs in general, how they communicate and how they fight with each other, and looking at it as more of a spectrum as opposed to like an on-off switch. Like you're never going to find that true success, and you're going to be constantly living in that fear of like, if I don't manage things just perfectly, if I don't let them out of their crate in this particular way, and if I don't, whatever, it's just, it becomes unsafe still, And again, I just remember, like, as we were working through those problems, like, just how freaking stressful it was. You know what I mean? You're talking, like, past just the emotional hurdles of things, then the financial hurdles of, like, we probably spent $5,000 on, like, vet bills and stuff, like, due to that kind of stuff. And luckily, we hit a point with them, like, by the end where, like, they were able to be together pretty much all the time, aside from, I think, when we had, like, guests come over and stuff, and that was truly just out of, let's just avoid that problem. You know what I mean? And then past that, so Kate, like obviously her dog Deli and Vera, when they first met each other, were pretty good with each other, but they had a lot of the competition stuff between each other. They used to play so freaking hard. And same deal. Like one day, This was pretty early into Kate and I dating with each other. I was out of town, and she was watching Vera, and she had Vera and Deli, and they were playing, and then it just switched. They just freaking got into battle royale with each other, and same deal. They really, really like fucked each other up, right? Like it was a gnarly dog fight, and like same deal. I just remember the emotions of like, oh my god, like from her end, from my end, like what are we gonna do about this, that, right? And same deal. Luckily, we kind of put them back together. We were aware of kind of the triggers that were kind of that kind of created what ultimately led to the problem, and you know how we weren't just we didn't do a good enough job of being in a position to address it the second that it happened, you know, and we put them back together, and ultimately they figured out their issue with each other, and now they're great. I mean, they haven't literally since that day gotten into any sort of squabbles with each other, because we allowed them to re-figure out how to interact with each other, as opposed to what most people do when the first fight happens, which is we immediately start separating all the time, and we immediately start anytime that we do have them out together with each other, have them on opposite sides of the room, or, you know, I start spending 2 months just doing nothing but bed stays with each other and this and that. We put them together, and we let them refigure out their issue once they were healed up and stuff, and they kind of worked it out, you know, and it was okay. And I think that's really the missing link with this is it's looked too much as like an obedience solving problem, where in actuality it's a do these dogs know how to interact with each other problem, and are we facilitating them being able to successfully do that? So
when you say that you let them kind of Vera and Deli learn how to work through it, what did that look like?
Yeah, so in their case, they didn't ever hit a point where it was super grudgy towards each other, you know? So, and typically speaking, after the first fight, it doesn't hit that point. It usually takes a couple of fights or a month of like just the conflict in the house before it starts turning that point where it's like, you know, on site we're trying to attack each other and everything. And in their case, it really was, and I see this a lot of times when we work with dogs that are getting in fights with each other, is, you know, we look at, again, play as it's play, then it's fighting, as opposed to play just being competition at its core. And as it intensifies, eventually it's going to turn into what we think of as fighting, but it's still the same thing. Like I was saying, it was on that spectrum, right? Mm-hmm. So their competition with each other, when it switched to the fighting, right, or when it intensified to the point where they were injuring each other, that's typically where we would want to create that off switch, right? That's typically where, okay, cool, we're going to let you guys work it out. And then it hits this point where it intensifies too much, and then we shut it down, and then we let you guys kind of get back into the groove and go up on that spectrum again until you guys figure out your problem, right? So it turned into the fight, right? Unfortunately, Kate wasn't in a position to be able to stop it. I don't think that their e-collars on or something. And luckily her friend was there, and they were able to break it apart. But like they didn't know how to break up a serious dog fight, especially when you're dealing with like two pit bulls that are fighting with each other, which notoriously is more intense than a lot of other breeds, obviously. So it just kind of it got really messy because of all of that. And I think that's why the fight ultimately was so bad, was because there was no, you know, we didn't know how to break it up. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So when we put them back together, luckily it wasn't like they really tried to fight each other again. They kind of went back through those same motions of like, okay, cool, we're interacting with each other, and then we start kind of playing with each other, and then it hits a point where it might kind of start to flip over, and that's where we create the off switch of adding the correction in for it. You know what I mean? Or we teach them to disengage and stuff at that point. But ultimately, I think really when we put them back together with each other, because we were just more aware of like supervising when they started playing with each other, it didn't wind up flipping over to that, and we didn't really need to do a whole lot of correcting for it, and ultimately they kind of just like figured out their relationship organically, like most dogs will, you know?
Do you think a big piece of that is the ability, I mean, obviously to a certain extent there was an emotional component from the humans, but I've always wondered if, because, you know, most average pet owners, they've never seen a dog fight. Mm-hmm. So it's like when they see their own dogs fighting, 100%. It's like another level. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah.
And so it's like, I feel like then after that initial fight, then they're constantly on edge, which is likely what's going to trigger more of the intensity of the fights in the future.
Yeah.
Whereas like with my own personal dogs, like they get into like
tics. Little squabbles.
Yeah, every now and then. And it's just like, because to me, you know, obviously I know what I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. There's no like continued fear that I'm like supplying to the situation. So the dogs are just like, oh, we just pissed each other off, whatever.
Well, yeah, and we know, like, when we're socializing any dogs, right, let alone our personal dogs, that the human element is typically what creates the confusion that leads to the ultimate fighting. You know what I mean? So, yeah, 100% people will get scared, and they will either, again, manage and separate and just, like, avoid the problem altogether, which intensifies it organically, right? Mm-hmm. Or, yeah, they'll, like, excessively micromanage, right? The second they even look at each other weird, it's like, hey, stop it, don't do that, this, that, right? Yeah. And it just creates more stress and more misunderstanding and stuff amongst the dogs that will lead to them just kind of feeling weird around each other, you know, which then, again, makes it more likely that they're going to get into fights in the future. Yeah, you're 100% right about that.